Most people walking through Washington Heights today would never guess how many times the ground beneath this neighborhood and the land just north of it in Inwood has been opened, scraped, carved, and rebuilt on top of old graves, because northern Manhattan wasn't always streets and apartment buildings and corner stores. It was once a patchwork of farms, family burial plots, church cemeteries, native village sites, and forgotten graveyards that the modern city built right over. And every time the city tried to force its grid across the rocky northern ridge, old bones surfaced, and the past forced its way back into the present. The story starts long before Washington Heights existed as a neighborhood, way back when Manhattan above 155th Street was still rural land. In the 1700s and early 1800s, wealthy families with farmland in northern Manhattan buried their dead on their own property, creating small family cemeteries on hillsides and along old dirt roads that don't appear anywhere on today's street map. And long before that, Lenape people lived throughout this entire ridge, including burial sites in what is now Inwood Hill Park, Seaman Avenue, and the northern end of Broadway. The oldest dead beneath this part of the island weren't European at all. They were indigenous, and their burial grounds were never mapped in a way the modern city cared to preserve. Then came the 19th century, when Lower Manhattan's burial crisis boiled over. The city was running out of space, and health officials blamed overflowing downtown graveyards for outbreaks of disease. So officials pushed burials north, opening new cemeteries uptown. The most famous one still standing is Trinity Church's Uptown Cemetery, opened in the 1840s at 155th and Broadway. Technically Washington Heights, which became Manhattan's last active cemetery, a place meant to ease pressure from the overcrowded churchyards downtown. But even with official cemeteries, dozens of small, unofficial, or family-owned burial grounds continued to dot northern Manhattan, especially in Inwood around Dyckman Street, Sherman Avenue, 10th Avenue, Seaman Avenue, and 204th Street to 212th Street. And those cemeteries eventually became problems once the city decided to extend the grid all the way up the island. The most infamous discovery happened not in Washington Heights proper, but just north of it, in Inwood, in March 1903. Workers grading land near 10th Avenue and 212th Street, a hill being cut down for new development, began uncovering human remains. At first a few bones, then entire graves arranged neatly in rows. Early newspapers sensationalized it, claiming gigantic skeletons and dramatic scenes. But later, archaeological investigations stripped away the myths. What they actually found was a colonial-era African burial ground, believed to be the resting place of enslaved people who worked on local farms owned by families like the Dykmans. The graves were oriented west, marked by uncut stones, about 36 individuals in total. There were no chains, no 7-foot skeletons, no upright burials, just human beings whose lives and deaths had been erased by time and development. That 1903 discovery wasn't some isolated shock. It was just the moment the entire city finally noticed that northern Manhattan's dead were still there. Lying beneath land developers were now carving up with dynamite and steam shovels. And the truth was already more complicated than the headline suggested. For example, the Cannonball newspapers mentioned wasn't dug out of the burial pits at all. The archaeological survey found it hundreds of yards away, near the old Revolutionary War positions, not among the graves. The press blurred everything together because cannonball near skeletons sounded dramatic, but the real story was simply this. The graves were old, unprotected, and in the way. Just a few blocks south, near Dyckman Street and Sherman Avenue, another burial ground surfaced in the 1890s when a small excavation cut into colonial graves containing European settlers. Local residents recognized family names on fragments of gravestones. This was a forgotten cemetery dating back to the 1700s that had simply faded from common memory as the farms disappeared and the city replaced them with row houses and shops. The remains were removed, but the exact record of where they went is shaky at best. Another major burial ground in the same northern zone was the Nagel Cemetery, located between 212th and 213th Streets near 10th Avenue. By the early 20th century, Newspapers reported that it may have contained hundreds to more than 1,000 burials, mostly members of early Dutch and English families, along with servants and children. When the land changed hands, developers were granted permission to clear the cemetery, and some of the remains were reportedly reinterred at Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. But like many removals from that era, only part of the story was officially documented. Historians later found that some graves were accounted for while others seemed to vanish from the records entirely, leaving open the possibility that portions of the cemetery were quietly built over. And that northern Manhattan burial pattern continued deeper in history too. At Seaman Avenue and 204th Street, construction workers uncovered Lenape burials early in the 20th century, remains associated with the indigenous communities who lived here long before the island was colonized. The finds included shell middens, village debris, and graves dating back centuries. Some of those remains were removed for study, some were reburied, and some were simply lost because early archaeology often treated native dead as scientific specimens rather than people whose graves deserved protection. Even Washington Heights itself holds its own layer of disturbed graves. The land near Fort Washington, where American soldiers made their stand against the British in 1776, workers occasionally reported finding bones believed to be soldiers. Those remains weren't always formally recorded, and in many cases the construction simply continued over the site. And there's another kind of disinterment woven into Washington Heights history, one very different from the chaotic removals of forgotten cemeteries. Up on Fort Washington Avenue at the St. Francis Cabrini Shrine, the remains of Mother Cabrini, the first American citizen to be canonized, were moved multiple times in the early 20th century, first exhumed from her original burial site upstate in 1933, then transferred to New York, then enshrined again in 1959. These were ceremonial reburials, treated with reverence instead of neglect, but they still fit into this larger pattern of northern Manhattan becoming a place where the dead didn't always stay where they were first laid to rest. So, when we talk about why the dead were dug up in Washington Heights, the answer isn't one moment or one shocking discovery. It's an entire history of the city advancing north and colliding with older histories that were never properly documented, protected, or honored. The dead were dug up because the city wanted streets and buildings where cemeteries once stood, because farmers didn't leave detailed maps of every burial plot on their land, because enslaved people were buried without legal recognition or long-term markers, because indigenous sites were treated as curiosities rather than sacred spaces, and because developers in the early 1900s often valued land far more than the bodies beneath it. What's different now is that New York is finally acknowledging what it once ignored. Community groups in Inwood and Washington Heights are researching the locations of these old burial grounds. Archaeologists are re-examining newspaper accounts and excavation notes to separate myths from facts. And a memorial is being planned for the African burial ground uncovered at 10th Avenue and 212th Street, a place where real people once lived, worked, suffered, and were buried, only to have their graves torn open by the modern city. So the next time you're standing in Washington Heights or walking north into Inwood, listening to the A train roar under your feet, or watching kids run across a schoolyard, remember this: the land up here holds layers of human history hidden right beneath the pavement. The Lenape dead, the colonial settlers, the enslaved people whose names were never written down, the war dead, the early families who farmed this ridge, they're all still here in one way or another because the city built over them before it learned how to remember them. And every time the ground was open for another road, another building, another cut into the rock, the past rose back up in the form of bones and stories the city couldn't ignore anymore.